What is up, everybody? This is the Founder Hour podcast. I'm your co-host, Pat, and on today's episode, we have the legendary Nolan Bushnell. Nolan is the founder of Atari and Chuck E, two iconic companies that have truly changed the world. He's known as the father of electronic gaming and the video game industry as we know it, and his story is just incredible. We talked about everything from Nolan's early days and upbringing, how he built Atari and Chuck E, the story of hiring Steve Jobs and why he decided not to invest in Apple early on, the projects he's working on right now, and his thoughts on Silicon Valley, the future of video gaming, and what he's generally most excited to see in the next 5 to 10 years. We started off our conversation by hearing about Nolan's childhood.
One of the things that, when I think about my childhood, our home was sort of the nexus of the neighborhood. That is, the kids always came over to my place because we always had stuff going on. And, it seems like my life was always full of projects. And projects have kind of been a center point of my life always on. And from building zip lines from the tree down to the down to the fence post, to tree houses, to digging holes and turning them into forts, and then later on I got into chemistry, and of course chemistry meant that you wanted to make things blow up, and so I had a blockhouse. I made a blockhouse so that I wouldn't hurt myself when I was, detonating my explosives. I would have been on a terrorist watch list if it had been a little bit later.
Well, if you looked like me and Pat, yes, that would have probably exacerbated it even further.
But I actually blew things up. I mean, I created pipe bombs and all the way from black powder to match heads. And
why'd you do that?
It was really about, I was very interested in chemistry, and that turned into rocketry. I built a liquid fuel rocket when I was probably 10 or 11 and almost burned my garage down. It was just projects. I wanted to invent stuff.
Did that come naturally to you, or was there someone in your family that, kind of put that, or, you sort of saw what they were doing and became inspired to do things yourself?
No, I was an absolute outlier. My parents suffered in silence. They would allow me. I mean, how many parents would allow their son to put a red and white striped pole with a flashing light on the top of it for an antenna pole? It's not normal to let kids run around on your roof. And mom would just say, well, make sure you don't fall off. That was kind of her admonishment.
I remember hearing a story. You talk about sort of, I don't know, maybe having like, you talk about sort of, entrepreneurial bugs that you had as a kid, selling strawberries and whatnot. How did that come about? Was there anyone in your family that had their own business, or you had seen that, entrepreneurship and starting a business is a, reasonable thing to do, or again, was it something that just came naturally to you?
Well, my dad had his own business. He was a cement contractor, and I would work with him summers. That was a little bit later on. I think I started working with him when I was 9. I think the strawberry thing happened when I was 6 or 7. But it was just the idea that I kind of like to make money, and the thought that you could do things to make money, not necessarily selling your time, but by selling a product. I don't know. It just seemed, I don't know where it came from. It just did.
Was the feeling of making money something that came out of like necessity, like you needed to make the money? Or was it, did you just get a thrill out of making money selling things?
A little bit of both. Definitely, maybe not when I was 6 or 7, but later on, when I got really involved in ham radio, the radios were expensive. And so I really had to up my game a great deal. And that's what pushed me into TV repair. And, uh, and that was a business that I made a lot of money at a very young age.
Nolan, it sounds like, early on you were this really curious kid who wanted to do things to just discover what you can do, right? And perhaps, at that moment you didn't realize that you were setting the stage for, a life of building things. But, you know, were other kids around you doing stuff like this, or were you just like that one, weird dude who's just doing his own thing, building stuff, or were you also just, hanging out with friends and doing things that kids normally do?
A little bit of both. Um, I was, I always thought of myself as the ringleader. And so I would often, get my friends to help me, like putting up an antenna pole was a 2 or 3 person job. And I could always, subvert these guys to help me out. And they always kind of like to play with the gadgets. When this will sound funny, but I had probably the first speakerphone in Utah. and I basically hacked the telephone and put it through an amplifier. And so kids had come over to call up girlfriends and not realize that everybody was listening. And they thought that was great fun.
So I know, kind of fast forwarding, I know you ended up going to the University of Utah and studying electrical engineering, which I guess wouldn't come much of a surprise if you knew Nolan in his younger days. And so, I guess when it came time to college, what did you envision sort of the rest of your career would look like? Like, what were you interested in?
I was always interested in electronics, but I actually had a branch point. And that was while I was in college, I was putting myself through school by, my dad died when I was 15. And so from that point on, I felt that I had to be financially independent because any money that I took from mom would be, she had some insurance money, but, I had 2 younger sisters and an older sister. And I felt that anything that I took would be coming out of their, college fund, what have you. And so it was just always normal to me that I was going to have to totally pay for my own college. And so I always had jobs, and working at the amusement park, it turned out that, and I took the job at the amusement park for all the wrong reasons. That is, I had this advertising company during the day, but I decided I was going to have the amusement park job at night, not to earn money because they paid crap wages.
You wanted to meet girls.
What's that?
You wanted to meet girls.
I wanted to meet girls, but I also wanted to keep myself out of harm's way because I knew, summers in Utah, you'd be taking girls out to dinner, you would be spending money instead of saving. So I thought by working, I could make a little bit, but it'd keep me out of harm's way because, I knew myself well enough that I could never resist temptation. Fundamentally, that was kind of my watchword. But then,
What were some of those temptations though at the time? Like what? I mean, like, could you share? Like, what did you think had you not like been in a more controlled environment? Like, what are some examples of things that you may have done?
well, I always wanted to have kind of a nice car, what have you, and things like that. In Utah, you could get a driver's license at 14. It was a daytime license, and it was a no friend license. That is, you could drive during the daytime, but you couldn't have any of your friends with you. Of course, I violated that all over the place, But I bought a car. I bought a Model A Ford. Overhaul. I bought it for $5. Overhauled the engine, got it going, and that was my car in high school. And I got actually pretty good at working on things. I bought a set of acetylene torches and customized it and all that sort of stuff. It was a project, but the amusement park experience was something that was what I call serendipity and kind of inadvertent, because it turned out that you, in the games department, you also got a commission. And so while the hourly rate was crap, I could make a lot of money on commission. So I was making the equivalent of $3 or $4 an hour, which was like, inflation adjusted is like $25, $30 an hour today. And I was sufficiently good that the manager left, and they made me manager of the whole games department. So at the ripe age of 20, I was managing about a $3 million annual department, and I broke all the records. I had the highest per cap game department in the nation. And so when I graduated from college, I had at the same time some offers from all over the country to come and work the games department with them, and at significantly higher salaries than what I was currently. In fact, it was a higher salary than I was going to get as an associate engineer.
And when you say games department, are we talking about sort of like the traditional like carnival style?
Yeah, throw balls, knock down milk bottles, make baskets, shoot darts, pop balloons.
Stuff I'm good at. The stuff I'm actually good at, not these video games.
It sounds like besides being good at the business side of things, did you also just enjoy working in that environment?
Loved it. Absolutely loved it. And in some ways, I was learning marketing, because what I was doing is I was selling, a game for 25 cents a play. And later on, that was clear. And I had 2 arcades that I was managing. So that taught me the economics of the coin-operated game business, which not a lot of people have. I knew how much coin-operated games cost. I knew how much they had to make per week in order to be a good return. And so that, combined with the other serendipity thing, which was Dr. Evans at the University of Utah, who was his big research was connecting video screens to big computers. And so if you were to see a video screen connected to a computer in 1965, there were 3 places in the world: Stanford, MIT, and the University of Utah. Which one doesn't belong? It was really lucky. He went on to found Evans and Sutherland Computer, which is the best graphics computer company in the world at the time. And, they were really a harbinger of new tech.
And had you not had that exposure while you were there, would you have even known at the time that that's possible to create games with a computer and connect it to a screen and have someone play it on the other side?
Well, it was when I was playing the games on the big computers, we'd sneak in at night and get computer time. And it was very easy for me to think that, hey, if I had this video screen connected to a coin slot at my arcade, it'd make money. But then you divide 25 cents a play for 3 minutes into $1 million computer, and the math didn't work. But at the same time, I thought to myself, hey, sometime this will be possible. The cost of computers will come down and it'll be good. Then the next kind of serendipity thing happens is the job that I got in California. When I graduated, I basically papered the with my resume in Silicon Valley. And my reason for going to Silicon Valley is I was a bit of a philosophy nerd and thought that semiconductors were the future, and that if you wanted to be a prince, you wanted to be on the right-hand side of the king. And so proximity, I always felt, was an important thing. And so that said Silicon Valley. But then I got a job at Ampex, which was in the video business. And so I really, sharpened my electrical engineering skills with a really crash course in video technology, which I was kind of good at it because of my TV repair stuff, but it was a little different. It was much higher class.
So Nolan, obviously you're doing all this stuff, right? You have multiple different jobs after jobs, and you have this electrical engineering degree. And as someone who, as a kid was a builder at heart, somebody who wanted to clearly be an entrepreneur, right? You talk about wanting to make money or realizing that money can be made from the things that you make. Were you satisfied with working for other people, or you just couldn't wait to get out and do your own thing?
I enjoyed working at Ampex, but I can remember when I was driving, I was married at the time, and I got married in college. And when I was driving from Utah to California, coming down the hill, I said, in 2 years, I'm going to start my own company. And it was almost like clockwork. 2 years of Ampex, and I started my own company.
So Nolan, explain to us, what happens after this, right? I mean, you obviously have experience with a few things, and you've been in that space, and you've gained experience. What came of this idea, and what was that, and where did that go?
First of all, I had no money. I mean, I was making a reasonable salary, and but I felt that I could be a engineering, basically a contract engineering company that would develop games for others. And so the first thing I did was license what turned out to be Computer Space to a company called Nutty Associates. And they had made a slide projector game that was a trivia game, and they'd done pretty well with it. And but the life cycle of a coin-operated game is about a year to 18 months. And so it was at the end of their cycle, and they desperately needed something new. And I showed them my prototype, and they said, yeah, let's license it. So we negotiated a licensing arrangement. And then they said, but we need a chief engineer. And I said, I don't know, I'm pretty expensive. And they said, well, how much do you need? And so I basically doubled the salary that I was getting at Ampex. And they said yes too fast, for which I said, and a company car. And I got it. And so coming home that night, I told my wife I doubled my salary, and she didn't believe me.
Was she surprised because she couldn't believe that you were able to double your salary? Or, I mean, why was she so surprised?
She just didn't think that you could just go double your salary, in a day. And
Yeah.
and it was the thing where I think her dad was a bureaucrat. He worked for the Bureau of Land Management. So she was not used to this wild ride of an entrepreneur.
I mean, were you used to it? I mean, is that something that you were prepared for in that moment in time?
I'm a great believer in fake it till you make it. And that you got to believe in dragons before you can slay them. And my wife often accuses me of building castles in the sky and then moving into them.
You know, it's funny that you have that point of view because I always hear mixed reviews about that, right? About fake it till you make it. Some argue that they're 100% believers of it. Others say don't ever do that, right? Lead with knowledge, like go in knowing what you're doing, right? What do you think makes people that fake it till they make it special? And why did it work for you?
I hate to admit this, but I am and always was intellectually arrogant. It was just kind of part of my DNA. And I felt that I could get any kind of a position based on skills that I didn't have, and that I could get those skills before they figured out that I didn't have them. And so it really came from optimism and intellectual arrogance.
And you're obviously working on something that at the time didn't have a lot of sort of, past history or precedent that you can sort of allude to. It was like, I mean, how were you going about talking about yourself and like, you know, having people believe that obviously you have all these skills where deep down I'm capable of learning them. Maybe I may not have them to the degree that I'm expressing, but I'll learn them quick enough. Like, how do you talk about stuff that I guess didn't have a lot of examples that I guess they could point to?
Well, I was, at that point in time, I was well versed in what the coin operated game business was. And so I could talk about how this was going to be bigger than Chicago Coin Speedway, as an example, which was kind of the hot game at the time. And so, I actually kind of did have a deep understanding of the marketplace that I was going into.
Got it. And was this the point where you decided to start Atari, or did that come several
Well,
years after?
we started the company as Syzygy, and that was the entity that Ted and I licensed to Nutting. And I went to work for Nutting, and then Ted came 3 months later, and we were office mates at Ampex, and we were basically slammed because we had to show a product for the AMOA show in Chicago that was going to be in October of that year. And so I cut the deal basically March 1st, March 2nd, something like that. So it was a vanishingly small amount to totally flesh out the technology, package it, get it ready to ship, the whole thing. And so I was basically, Ted and I, during that summer, we were working literally 18-hour days.
But this was your own company that you were licensing out to Nutting?
Well, no, we were actually at the Nutting facility because I was chief engineer there.
Got it.
So they were paying me a salary and licensed the product that I was creating.
Did you have the idea that we're eventually going to spin out and create our own company at the time?
Not necessarily. My mind was at the point that I still thought that I didn't have enough money to start manufacturing, and have a factory and all that. It was I still thought of myself as an engineer that was doing contract engineering.
Mm-hmm. And so, what did this project end up becoming, and where does it go from there?
Well, what happened is that Nutting Associates turned out to be a company run by idiots, and it was actually kind of good because whereas if they'd have been just a little bit smarter and willing to kind of treat me like a partner rather than just an employee, I would have probably been happy to stay there. But I just felt that they could screw up anything. And so I made a determination to quit. And in order to do that, I needed a couple of other contracts. And by that time, I had a reputation in the coin-op business. And I went to Bally, and they signed up for a contract in which they were going to pay me another, I think it was $5,000 a month, which gave us an ability to, and I offered to build the second game for Nutting under contract. And that was what allowed us to open up shop of our own on our own in our own place, Scott Boulevard, actually.
And so did that mean you had to go out and create not only the software, but the physical sort of hardware, like the cabinets, to then place in wherever you were going to place these games in? And how did you go about doing that? I mean, even though you knew about the, coin operated business, did you know how to build it? Did you know where to go to build it and finding the right manufacturers and all that stuff?
Sorta. I mean, we knew who were the contract manufacturers for Nutting, and I had taught a bunch of service schools. For Nutting, I'd flown around the country to each of the distributors and taught a service on how to repair computer space. In addition to that, we bought the prototypes. We had 4 prototypes for the trade show that were A standard. They were prototypes. And so I was the only one that could really keep them going. And so we put those on location. So we had not just our contract income, but we all of a sudden had a street route where we had them in bars and restaurants, and would collect the money every week.
So at what point, I guess, does Pong come along and Atari sort of starts taking off, and now you have, I'm assuming, a lot of different customers. I don't know if they were arcades or bars or who they were, but you start putting these sort of consoles in these places and starting to make like real money.
Well, this was another mistake, if you would. I had we had enough money that I wanted to hire another engineer, and we hired Al Alcorn. And I thought for him to get up to speed on our technology, that I'd have him build the simplest game I could think of, which was Pong, and it turned out to be fun, and much more fun than I expected it to be. And I actually flew back to Chicago to see if I could get Bally to take it instead of the driving game, because completing the contract 3 months early, I thought that would be a good thing to do. Well, they didn't want it, because at that point in time there were no successful coin operated games that were only 2-player. But while I was in Chicago, the machine they built one, just out of plywood and contact paper, and put it in a bar. And it made so much money in such a short period of time that by the time I got on the airplane to come back, it was very clear that this was a very special game. And I thought, hey, maybe we can build it. And I figured out all the money that we had, and I figured that we had enough money to build 12 units. And so we did. And
when you began, or when you left to start Atari, it was you and your co-founder, right?
correct.
I know the answer, but maybe for those that don't, how did that relationship end up?
I ended up buying out Ted probably a year and a half later. And Ted was a really good analog engineer. He was a horrible manager. And for him to have a big ownership, he just couldn't keep from screwing things up. And so I decided to buy him out, and I bought him out with some cash because we were having cash flow, and he got the route. He got all the machines that we had on location, which was throwing off probably $100,000 a year. And this is in a world where a associate engineer was making $800 a month. So it was all of a sudden Ted thought he was a rich man.
Was that an easy choice for you, and did it end up being the right decision?
It was definitely the right decision. It was a hard choice because Ted was such a good guy, and when you work side by side with somebody building something, you always have a really soft spot in your heart with him.
Right. So how long does that coin-operated sort of business last for Atari? And at what point do you start thinking about, hey, what if we can create a home video game system that our fans or our users or whoever's loves Atari can play these games at home on their television?
Started out by doing Pong on a chip, and it was really enabled by the creation of N-channel technology, which was a large-scale integrated circuit using N-channel. And N-channel allowed the chip to move to operate at high frequencies. And there were only 4 places in the world that had N-channel technology. One of them was MOS Technology, and they built the chip for us. And Al,
were you seeking this out, or did it sort of fall in your lap, or like how did you even come across this? Because I can imagine, just like how were you able to find out about this and be exposed to then have the idea, oh, we can put a game on this chip and we could sell this console to people?
it was actually Al Alcorn, and that was what one of the great things about being in Silicon Valley is you hear about things early. Sidelines of a little league game. I can think of several times that just a PTA meeting with another father who was working with one of the chip companies, all of a sudden I was talking about a problem and he'd say, we've got a chip that's just under development. I'll send you one, and things like that. And that's kind of, Al heard about the N-channel technology and thought to himself, hey, it looks like this could work. We hired a guy that knew how to design chips, and we were off to the races.
It's so crazy because now obviously so much has changed where the internet, everyone's just talking over the internet, and it's hard to perhaps hear or overhear someone talking about something. And now that everyone's talking about decentralization and, they're moving all over the country and all over the world and you can work remotely. I just wonder, I mean, maybe you can share some of your thoughts on this, but like, I wonder if it's the same now, or like how I guess if it's if that allure of Silicon Valley is still very much present, or Silicon Valley is just like a thought, right? Like that could be applied to any place, but if that still exists in your opinion.
Well, Silicon Valley has something right now that is actually quite important. If you're a company in Silicon Valley, you have a much higher probability of getting venture capital. And that's because they want, the VCs want to be on the board and they don't want to travel that much. They like to be able to drive down. And so Sand Hill Road is actually a big magnet right now still. It's becoming less important. I mean, I've got a new thing that I'm working on right now, and I've done probably 4 VC pitches over Zoom. And so I think it's softening somewhat. The whole idea of proximity being, whereas it was 8 stars out of 10, I think it's now 5 stars out of 10 proximity.
Nolan, I really want to hear the story about, Wozniak and Jobs and how they approached you guys early on. I believe it was in the mid-'70s, right?
Yeah, Jobs Jobs came and showed up in our lobby and said, "I'm not leaving until you hire me." Typical job.
Atari fan, or how had he had he just come across like a coin operated system somewhere, and he was like, I want to work for this company, or how do you think he even
I
found out
think
about
we were in games because he was always this was kind of the hippie days, anti-Vietnam War kind of thing. And so by being a non-military contractor, that was kind of a step up. Second, we were doing games, and I think he thought that it looked like it'd be fun.
it? And I think if I know correctly, I think you were like his only boss. I don't know if you've ever had another boss before, but I think you had mentioned somewhere that Wozniak didn't actually work for Atari. It was just kind of helping
Yeah, well,
Jobs out with.
that's why I put Jobs on the night shift, is because I knew Woz was going to be there, and I used to joke and say I got two Steves for the price of one.
But had you seen what had you seen in them at the time where you're like, all right, Wozniak obviously is this crazy brain. He's gonna do things. Obviously, Steve Jobs is Steve Jobs. But like, what did you see in them at the time, and did you think that they would eventually end up creating the most valuable company in history?
I early on in my career, because what we were doing was sufficiently different than anything else, I hired for one characteristic, and that was passion and enthusiasm. And the thing that isn't talked about that much, but Jobs had one speed, full on, or whatever he did, and he was a guy on a life mission, and it really came through very, very clearly. I mean, he was the only guy in our engineering department that had a futon under his desk, and sometimes I'd find him, sleeping Monday morning when I'd come in at 7.
Was he like a difficult person to manage, or was he like a good employee?
He was a horrible person to manage, absolutely impossible, because he didn't abide fools gladly. And when he'd have a boss, he didn't report directly to me. He had there were a couple of layers in between. And if he thought they were dumb shits, he'd tell them, that's a fucking dumb thing to do, And that's another reason why I put him on the night shift, because I kept him from being fired about 3 times.
And Nolan, I know that later on, obviously Jobs and Wozniak both went on to do incredible things, but they came to you guys and, I believe offered Atari to help with the actual computer system, but you weren't necessarily interested in the time. And then he also offered you a third of the company for $50,000.
That's right.
You made the smart decision of saying no.
Not too smart.
You would have been. I mean, you would have been up there with Jeff Bezos today. But that's a whole different story. But why'd you say no? I mean, I'm just curious. Sure, looking back, it's the stupidest decision one can ever make. But in that moment, it must have not been that stupid. And I'm curious why you said no.
I didn't think Jobs had a snowball's chance in hell of being a successful CEO. Nor did Wozniak. Wozniak was, Wozniak was a very timid nerd. The old joke: how do you tell a nerd extrovert from a nerd introvert? The nerd extrovert looks at your shoes instead of his own.
So you just had no faith that Steve Jobs and Wozniak can lead a company.
Correct. Well, and I actually think that if I had invested, it may have been different, because I didn't have the time at the time to be the mentor. But I introduced him to Don Valentine, who introduced him to God, all of a sudden I've got a blank.
Mike
Marklet, who turned out to be the first president of Apple, and really mentored Steve and turned him into an executive.
Right. But I've heard somewhere, and I don't know if you can obviously give your honest thoughts here, but I've heard somewhere that you don't really have any regrets because of how different it would have been for your own life. Is that right?
Yeah, because, in some ways, after you make a certain amount of money, more lets you play in different poker games, but it doesn't really help your life. And at some point, you actually lose personal life. Like the idea of going around with bodyguards and things like that, like Zuckerberg and those guys, I wouldn't want that.
So I think it was kind of fast forward. I think it was like the mid to late 70s. You end up selling Atari to Warner Communications for I think about 28 million, if that's right.
Yeah.
Why did you decide to sell at the time? And do you have any, I guess, regrets about selling perhaps too early or too late? Or how did you feel about the whole thing?
I kind of had to. We had finished the design on the 2600, the Atari, the cartridge system. And we just didn't have enough money to put it into Christmas. And so we started out, we thought we were going to go public to raise the capital. And at that point in time, the venture capital world was tiny little funds. $20 million funds, $30 million funds. And we needed about $10 million bucks. And that was just not available from VCs. Taking it public would have been great, but the market didn't want IPOs at the time. It was one of these things where the market was down and it didn't work. And so we started on this quest to find a corporate investor, of which Warner was one of them. And they songed and danced us and gave me an offer I couldn't refuse, so I didn't refuse it.
And had you started Chuck E. Cheese at this time already through Atari?
Atari, yes.
How did that come about? Because so that happened before you sold, and so how did you, I guess, come up with the idea? I guess it kind of makes sense. Thinking about being in the arcade business and also having your own gaming consoles, and then I guess putting them into a physical space that also sold pizza and food. But was there kind of anything more to that? Like, how did you kind of envision Chuck E. Cheese and what it would become? Because we, both Posh and I, we grew up in the '90s, and anyone who grew up in the '80s and the '90s, I mean, it's a staple. It's like Chuck E. Cheese is a big part of your childhoods. And so, how did the whole idea conceptualize from the beginning?
It was really driven by what I call vertical integration towards the market. And we were selling games, coin-operated games, for $1,500 to $2,000. In their lifetime, they would earn somewhere between $30,000 and $50,000 in coin drop. And so I said, hey, we're on the wrong side of this equation. But I didn't want to compete with my customers, and the competition was on locations. Go into Joe's bar, put games in, split revenue, or go into a mall and rent a space to set up an arcade. There were already people doing that. And so I felt that I had to do a standalone place. And I also knew that younger kids loved the games, but there weren't any good places. The little kids and teenagers don't mix. They just don't. And so I felt that there was a huge market gap or a sucking sound for kids, 2 to 12 that would love to play the games with their parents. And so I decided to do a kids-oriented game center, and then have it around food and entertainment.
I'm sure when people hear that the founder of Atari is also the founder of Chuck E. Cheese, they're like, wait, what the fuck? Like, the same guy? Are you kidding me? What the hell was he thinking? Right? But then when you hear about, why you did it, it makes a lot more sense. But, what was Chuck E. Cheese like in the early days? And, did you enjoy running that business?
No. Well, yes and no. There are certain businesses that need innovation all the time. Once the die had sort of been cast, and with Chuck E. Cheese, our first unit was 5,000 square feet, and we knew the day we opened that it was too small. Then we rented an old Safeway store that was 25, 30,000 square feet. That was too big. And the third one we opened was 15,000, and that was about right. And so it was just a matter of replicating that. And I worked out the franchising, and that kept me interested for about a year and a half. And then it got really boring, because there was, I kept trying to innovate, but you just shouldn't innovate when something's working like that.
Right. I think one of the things that people remember or know about Chuck E. Cheese is that pizza time animatronic, those animals that sing, right? I mean, it's definitely a clear memory in my head. Been to too many parties at Chuck E. Cheese as a kid. What was the inspiration for that? I mean, where do you come up with this stuff?
Oh, hey, I'm an editor. The Chuck E. Cheese show came right out of Tiki Room from Disney.
Wow. Okay. What was it about Disney that you were so into?
When I graduated with an engineering degree, I wanted to work for Imagineering. Because remember, if you had an engineering degree and you knew something about amusement parks, the top of the stack was Disney. They didn't want to. They didn't want to give me the time of day. So
who would have thought? I mean, now that you say it, I mean, you could have been an excellent CEO of Disney with what the stuff that you built. I mean, you would have been the perfect person for that job.
Yeah, because the guy that was running it at the time was a real bozo. He was like the husband of one of Walt's daughters, and he really,
was it Roy?
Meisner came along that really did some good stuff for the company.
Right.
So you mentioned kind of the feeling of like lack of innovation in the early days, but obviously the company lasted for, over 40 years.
Still around.
How, I guess in more recent times, like how have you felt about just sort of the future of Chuck E. Cheese and where it's going? I mean, I know you're not as involved anymore, but how are your general feelings about that before we sort of move on to everything you're working on now?
Well, I think old founders always think that their baby is being mismanaged. It's just kind of, not horribly mismanaged, but they were able to milk the cash cow that I created. And I think that I was actually part of the advisory of when Apollo bought Chuck E. Cheese out from the public shareholders. And that was okay. Right now, I think that with COVID and what have you, when private equity comes in and takes over a company, I think they put in $200 million of equity, and the rest of it was senior and subordinated debt. And so when things went south a little bit, they missed some of their debt payments, and now I'm pretty sure it's controlled by the debt holders, and the equity is wiped out.
Is there anything big that they should have done, or I guess you would have done if you were still running the business, that you would have liked to see them do?
Yes. I always felt that there was a lot that Chuck E. Cheese had the opportunity to. Chuck E. Cheese always had the problem of weekdays, and that essentially you covered all your overhead and made a little bit of profit Friday night, Saturday night, and Sunday. If you could get something going on Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, it would just gush cash. And I always felt that Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, that you had a facility that could be used with an educational spin to it. Get the kids in sort of as an after-school thing to learn about tech or even restaurant operations. Just something, because I felt that there's a lot of parents that would like their kids to have additional training and additional knowledge of things. And I always felt that Chuck E had that opportunity.
Nolan, clearly you're a guy who doesn't run out of energy, and after you sell Atari, after you sell Chuck E. Cheese, and you're no longer doing this stuff. Even though I assume maybe you were involved behind the scenes, you created what became one of like the first incubators, right? Business incubators, which a lot of people know today. Y Combinator, for example, in Silicon Valley, is probably one of the most prominent and one of the biggest incubators out there. But you were clearly one of the pioneers for what you were doing as well. How did you come up with that idea to say, what, beyond just money, I want to take on these businesses that are starting off, mentor them, teach them, give them some sort of resources, and then see where they go?
At Atari, I always had a lot of projects that were in the germination stage. And when Warner bought it, they basically closed them all down, which said to me that I was spending money that I didn't get any benefit for. And so I thought to myself, hey, if I've got these ideas and these things, let's just spin up. More than half of the companies that I funded in Catalyst, which was the name of the incubator, were self-created. I basically put management team around it, funded it, and what have you. I also felt that there was some streamlining that could go on, that people come in insular packages, and a small company doesn't need a CFO. But 6 companies that are small could fully engage a CFO and they'd share.
Right.
So my idea was that I could automate the incorporation process, payroll, what have you, and that once I decided to fund somebody, I could have them incorporated, have a payroll set up, have health insurance, all that stuff done. The CEO signs his name 14 times, and all of a sudden he's in business and starts working on his project instead of all this paperwork that you have to do to start up a company.
Nolan, as somebody who's a self-proclaimed intellectually arrogant, right? What were you like or are like now as a manager or a leader? I mean, are you the kind of person that's open door policy, come talk to me whenever you want? Or do you put power and influence in the hands of a few certain managers and let them run the business however they want it to be run?
I'm very, very hands off. I really try to get good people, and I think of myself as more of a cheerleader than a business manager. That we agree on a direction, and it doesn't need to be my way of executing that direction. And I think that that's a much better way than if you try to micromanage somebody.
Obviously, since starting Atari, we've seen companies like Sony come along with the PlayStation, and Microsoft with the Xbox, and just so many other sort of people entering the space, and the industry has grown so much. I think I read, the global gaming industries, did $160 billion in 2020, and it's growing by almost 10% year over year. And as someone who's obviously been known as the father of electronic gaming, and someone who sort of was a pioneer, has been a pioneer, and just sort of created this whole industry. How do you feel about where the industry has come, and where do you see it going from this point?
First of all, I'm quite proud, but my rule is don't live your life looking in the rearview mirror. Always keep forward focus. And I think that, Warner populated the management of Atari with record people. And they were so focused on software that they didn't realize that they were also in the record player business. And so they basically didn't obsolete themselves with a new, better unit. In fact, one of the reasons I left is I said, hey, we got to start on the second version. And they said, well, but this is really a good system. And the crash in '83 was really them thinking they could push that, what I considered to be an obsolete 2600, into the market for another year. And it couldn't. They really needed to upgrade. And for example, when the 2600 was designed, memory was very, very expensive. A year later, it was 1/100th the cost per bit. So the Atari 2600 had 128 bytes of memory, not kilobytes, bytes. And, the next unit, we could have had a complete line buffer that would have given us, high resolution, multiple colors, all kinds of great stuff that the 2600 didn't, with the 1/4-inch pixels and it was just junk, compared to what it could have been. And anyway, and that was, Warner didn't want to do it, and they paid the price for it.
And so now there are obviously many, many people who have built a career on the top of this type of technology, right? And it just the industry is just growing and growing. We've had we've had the founder of Riot Games, who created League of Legends, on the podcast, and several other folks in the space. And it's kind of hard to, or not hard, but it's crazy to see where it's come from those days. But how, I guess, where do you see the industry in your eyes going from here? Does it just keep growing to the point where, there's just a bunch of people in the space creating games? And
Well, I don't think you can talk about the industry anymore. You have to talk about industries. And it turns out that the console game is different than the PC gaming environment, very different from the VR headsets, the Oculus Rift and all that, different than the games that you play on your iPad or Android tablet.
right,
Different still from the ones that you play on your phone. Each of these are kind of separate ecosystems for gameplay. Have kind of different rules, different monetary sets. And I think that will continue. I think that there will be a whole series of games that are going to be augmented reality as opposed to virtual reality. And I think virtual reality is just starting to get its breath right now. And I think that's going to be very, very big.
Do you think that's going to create a more democratized creator community where, there are going to be tools where, more and more people that don't have perhaps the experience of, coding a video game from scratch can create their own, games?
Yeah, it already has happened. Unity, I know 8-year-olds right now that are doing apps using Unity. And it's just exactly what you said. It's a series of tools, and they're really accessible for somebody. I know beyond a shadow of a doubt that if those had been available from when I was 8, I would have been a game designer then or now.
Right. So talk to us about where you're working now on now. I know you have a couple different projects, and you're getting really creative with the board games and different things. So tell us a little bit about what you're working on and what's going on there.
I love the Amazon Echo and the Google Home. I think the speech recognition is magical. And the things that I'm working on there are board games that are mediated or enhanced by the smart speakers.
Hmm.
So we've got a game out called Saint Noir. You can get it on Amazon right now, in which you are the detective and you are verbally interrogating suspects and trying to figure out who's lying and to solve it. And it's just really a lot of fun. And we actually have a Kickstarter that'll be going, I think, the 16th of this month
Mm.
for another game that has the best focus group that I've ever seen. People laughing and slapping each other on the back and just having a great time, even when they're sober. And it's even better with a little bit of alcohol. And it's called Star Edition. And go into you got to go into Kickstarter and buy some because it's going to be great. We're
Nolan,
actually,
I know.
go ahead.
We'll definitely check it out. And I know that, it's easy for somebody to just kind of Google your name and go through a list of all of your accomplishments and everything you've worked on and, all the stuff you're working on. And things that interest me are like, what you've done with Modal or with anti-aging games and Brain Rush. I mean, the list goes on with all the stuff that you've done on a more recent level as opposed to just Atari and Chuck E. Cheese. But I'm curious, of everything that you've done, of all the projects from 4 years old to now that you've worked on, almost 70 plus years, what's your number one favorite? If you had to rank them, right, from one to whatever, what's number one?
My family. I've got 8 kids, and they are the joy of my life. And for example, Brent opened 2-Bit Circus, which is a micro amusement park, 50,000 square feet. Yeah, have you been there?
I've heard of it. I haven't been yet.
Oh, you got to go. Well, after COVID, Tyler done Polycade, which is a wonderful gaming system, coin-op for the home. I mean, it's not coin-op for the home, but it plays all the old favorites. So the stuff that I used to love at Chuck E. Cheese, I've now got it in my entryway. My my youngest son, Wyatt, just got a 6-figure advance designing games that he's about to go, and he's just doing some great stuff. Gavin designed some of the games for 2-Bit Circus. Dylan, he's shot a movie. He's done some great stuff. My oldest daughter does PR for all of us, and and I got a daughter in finance and a daughter who is a published author and a PhD. I just feel like my dad always said if you can get your kids to be 21 without being in rehab or jail, you've accomplished something.
Well, the bar is low, but I totally get it. I mean, it's tough. I mean, you were obviously, a working dad and, spending time building these incredible companies. How are you able to find, a rhythm between your work and your life and everything else that was going on and keeping your mental health sane and keeping your physical health fine? How were you able to balance all of this stuff?
Kids don't need quantity as much as they need quality. And so I set up things very early on where I would have really good quality time with the kids. And we would work on projects together. And every Sunday, I would take one of them out to breakfast, just one-on-one, usually a half hour away. I'd take them to a weird spot, where old fishermen would be coming in or truck drivers or what have you. But the idea was to have at least a half hour, 45 minutes in the car, talking about their life and what have you, and everybody knew whose turn it was, and they looked for it, and then I'd spoil them a little bit after breakfast, and we'd go somewhere fun. And then the second thing I would do is do an overnight. I'd take kids on a business trip with me, and they'd sit right next to me during the meetings and what have you. And I felt that one, they got to know what Dad did, and second, we'd get to hang a little bit on some intensive place. When they were 12, they could go domestically with me overnight. When they were 14, they could go to Europe with me. And when they were 16, they got to go to Asia with me. And so it was fun for me because, it's taking your kids to Japan for the first time. You got to experience, Japan through their eyes like it was almost the first time. And, I always felt that one of the prime responsibilities of a father is to teach their kids about the world. And so we kind of do that.
Someone like you that had entrepreneurship just sort of hardwired in their brain from such a young age, and for folks listening who are perhaps younger, on the younger side, that are just getting their careers started today, if you were to start your career today, what would you do? I mean, where would you go? How would you go about things, knowing what you know now and where the world is at now?
First of all, I'd make the decision, do you know what you want to do? If you do, go for it. If you don't know what you want to do, I would go to Las Vegas, rent an apartment, and go to every trade show. Fake a press pass so you don't have to pay. And you just attend every trade show. You walk the floor, and you see if you can get a job as an intern randomly. I believe that too many kids want to be an entrepreneur, and they don't have enough work experience at all. I probably had 20 jobs before I started Atari, all the way from amusement park to selling advertising to repairing cars, repairing TVs, working in a clothing store. And I just think that all of that stuff prepares you. And everybody needs to know a little bit of accounting. You need to know a little bit about media.
So on that point, though, as someone who obviously, you were like, Steve Jobs was, a young guy. Wozniak was a young guy working for you. Like, they were not very well experienced at the time, and they obviously went on to create what they created. But do you think examples like them are anomalies? They're just rare to find. They're a rare breed. Or do you think that, like, what was it about them that you saw back then that could explain why they were able to be successful without a lot of experience?
There's 2 or 3 things that are characteristic of big innovation. The more innovative somebody is, the less likely they are to be taken seriously. That is, when you're doing, a disk drive company that is 10% better than the competition, everybody gets it. But when you're doing something like a 10 times bigger pizza parlor with talking robotic animals, that's kind of a stretch for a lot of people. And entrepreneurs that are truly good at drastic innovation are kind of rule breakers. They're kind of outliers. They're the kind of people that, I get a kick out of these companies that any new employee gets interviewed by 20 people in the company. That's sure to create mediocrity. You don't get innovation from a democracy. You get it from a one crazy bastard that's willing to say this will work. And I told Steve, I said, if you go into a room of 50 people and everybody says you're crazy and you think you're right, you probably are.
Wow.
Nolan, I'm curious, who is one entrepreneur, living or dead, that you look up to and have always looked up to?
Elon Musk, easily.
Why?
He's basically taken innovation in a lot of ways and really pushed on it. I just like the fact that he does things and he doesn't take himself totally seriously, and I just respect that a lot.
Have you met him?
Yes, I have.
And what did you? I mean, what did you guys talk about? What did you guys think of each other?
Well, I don't know what he thought of me. I think he thought of me as probably an old fart, but I just felt that wide-ranging conversation on a lot of different things. I was very interested in battery technology and how you could increase the charge speed, because I felt that charge speed is a really important thing. And I feel like there's not enough work being done on rapid charge. The chemical processes, and my theory is that if you created massively parallel batteries, you could increase the charge speed.
Mhm. You're working on all these projects right now. What is kind of your vision for, I guess, what this creates? Like, what are you most excited for, I guess, in the next, 5, 10, 15 years to come?
Well, I've got a couple of things in stealth mode that I can't talk about, but I really like the Amazon Echo stuff. And that also leads to I want to do a television series using branching narrative. I don't know if you saw Bandersnatch, the Black Bear.
Yep.
It's a branching narrative story. And I believe that is a really interesting thread for the future of entertainment, where
For those listening that haven't seen it, it's the one where, you sort of reach a point in the show or in the movie where you can choose where the movie goes next. You have multiple options. There are different, endings. There are different ways that the trajectory of this film could go, and it's ultimately yours to decide. And it's more interactive than a traditional movie or show.
Exactly. And the way I look at it is there's kind of a continuum. There's game here, there's movie here, and then there's some things in between here. And if you have a lot of branching, it's more game. If you have a little bit of branching, it's more movie. And somewhere, the person who figures out where that right spot is, I think that there's a few $billion business there.
I agree, and I think, speaking of gamification in general, it's just such an interesting phenomenon because you apply it to anything, and it starts getting your sort of juices flowing and your brain going, and it's not you're not sitting idly. It's more active than passive in terms of whatever you're interacting with. So one area that I've personally wanted to see a lot more gamification is education, because I think it could help with just retention. It could help with attention,
Yeah.
especially with young.
Well, there's this thing called flow state, which when you're building a video game, you want to get your player into flow state as soon as you can. And we discovered that very, very early on. We didn't call it flow state. We called it suspension of disbelief.
And is that this perspective of it, where they're in the state of flow, they're not really thinking about how much money they're spending on a game, or is it just like from another? Yeah.
Well, if you look at the fortunes throughout the world, they all have some addiction associated with it, whether we're talking about coffee or alcohol or even chocolate. And so I always felt that if I could create an addiction around games, that I was going to be successful. And I think we were pretty good at it.
Yeah, 100%.
Well, Nolan, I think we could sit here for days and talk about everything you've done and all your thoughts and ideas. And as much as I'd love that, I know that Nancy's gonna kill us if this keeps going further. She's probably gonna kill you before she kills us.
But
But
she's running around doing dinner right now. So yeah.